Arianna with her guest, Jerry Brown. From the heart.
Rare blends of coffee is one of my avocations. I like to choose the different coffee beans from selected areas.
No, do you do that?
No, I don't. That's one of my... I like Colombian coffee. At least I thought I did once. This suit feels like a tent. It's a very cheap suit.
Is it? Doesn't
very cheap. It's a $150 suit.
Okay.
So what's your plan now? Where are we going?
Now we're going to move right on to intuition.
Does that look all right?
He's worried more about how he looks than I am. Do you think
you
the
look
male...
fine.
What about the male... I'm supposed to be worrying about how I look. How my hair looks like.
Because I have a cheap suit. Everyone's told me it looks cheap, and I just don't want to convey an excessive image of frugality.
In 1978, I wrote a book about the crisis in political leadership and sent a copy to Jerry Brown. 4 years later, over a discussion here at his home in Los Angeles, my original impression of him was confirmed. Here was a man who dared to question, to think, to initiate ideas, and not merely react to what opinion polls told him the electorate wanted to hear. Thinking aloud in the full glare of the media is not easy. And in the course of his 12 years in politics, Jerry Brown has produced many ideas that were not fully thought out and lacked the power of a coherent strategy. Politicians today are not expected to think, rethink, let alone change their minds. Political leadership was not the first path Jerry Brown chose. At the age of 18, he entered the Sacred Heart Seminary, intending to become a Jesuit priest. Life there was tough, ascetic, and simple. But after 3.5 years, the spiritual concepts began to lose their reality for him, to seem too abstract and removed from the vital world that by now he longed to be part of. So he left and plunged into the total contrast of life at the University of California at Berkeley. From Berkeley he went on to Yale, where he studied law, and in 1969 he entered the family business, politics. Just 5 years later, following in his father's footsteps and succeeding Ronald Reagan, he became governor of California at the age of 36.
A threat to the environment, the uncertainty in our economy and the monetary system, a lack of faith in government, the drift in political and moral leadership. It's not the work of one person, it's the work of all of us working together. I ask your help. Thank you very much. We have a lot of work to do. Let's get to it. Thank you very much.
The media gradually built an image of Jerry Brown as mystical, austere, and above all, disdaining the trappings and luxuries that go with high office. The most highly publicized symbol of this was his decision not to live in the grand governor's mansion built by Ronald Reagan. Instead, he chose to live here, in this functional house in Los Angeles, and in a small rented apartment in Sacramento. Over those 8 years, the two Jerry Browns, Hamlet agonizing over the rightness of his ideas, and action men relishing the hurly-burly of political activity, have coexisted in a state of creative unease that makes him one of the most complex, intriguing, and unpredictable figures on the national political scene. A lot has happened to him since 1976, and whatever the setbacks, Jerry Brown is still young enough to remain for many more years in the public eye, pursuing his ultimate dream, the dream of becoming President of the United States.
Why? What do you want to know?
He sounds so aggressive about it.
What did you dream about last night?
Yes, we wanted to tell us
can't
about
remember.
what you dreamed. The last dream
I
you
think it's
remember.
appropriate for a political leader to discuss his dreams.
Why
Okay.
not?
Because that... You never...
What is this kind of image suddenly that you have to preserve? You're going to do it your own way, remember?
Do you think did Demosthenes talking about his dreams?
Pericles did.
But they were all political dreams. It's all right.
How important is your intuition in making decisions?
My intuition? I don't know. When I make a decision, it's a combination of a lot of things. I have a hunch about something, then I'll test it by talking to other people, and at some point I'll decide what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be a unity in one's life, and so there shouldn't be the separation between your conscious thoughts, your unconscious. Those are just words that you try to grasp the complexity of what a human being is. And I feel that I'm in touch with my feelings, with when I see something or I try to do something or not do something, I mean, I react as a total person. It's not just some logical analysis, but it's how I relate to a given decision or whatever I want to do or not do. So I wouldn't say that I'm not thinking about the intuitive or the unconscious. I probably am.
When you talked about reacting as a unity, do you think that your life, if one compares it to, say, the Greek concept of the balanced whole man, would you say that your life is balanced?
Well, I don't think I don't think this age is very balanced, so I wouldn't think that my life is as balanced as it should be.
What is the main imbalance, would you say?
Well, just the way, the type of society we have, the competitiveness of it, the stress, the striving. There's a certain imbalance in all that. Now, whether that's good or not, I don't think you really know.
Yes, you have said that there are many other things that are important in life apart from politics. What are some of these things in your life?
Well, I don't think you compare those things. I mean that's a truism, that there are many, in saying there are many things more important than politics, because ideal in that world would be like to an athlete saying there are many more things important than athletics, or if you're a businessman, there's many more things that are important other than business. So your work is one part of your life. It defines you to a great extent, but there's friends, there's one's spiritual life, there's art, there's athletics, there's adventure, there's whatever, there's personal relations, there's whatever, there's your family, and all of that is part of the mosaic, part of what it is to be alive.
But do you find that politics dominates your life to the exclusion of the rest of the mosaic?
Well, certainly when you're a governor and you're on call almost totally, that's a very dominating experience or job. It's not like you go to work for 40 hours a week and then you put down your toolbox and take your shoes off and flip the television on and open up a can of beer and transform yourself with soap operas or sporting events. It doesn't quite work that way.
It doesn't have to be that way. I mean, the alternative to being completely single-minded about something is not being transformed by soap operas, is it?
I mean, there's certain jobs that tend to be encompassing. A general, president, a prime minister, a governor. These are roles that are they fill out a good part of your life.
Are you suggesting then that marriage and having a family are not compatible with that kind of intensity?
No, it's quite, as long as there's a partnership in the common cause, I think it's very compatible.
So you don't rule it out?
No.
You've said in the past that one can learn from defeat and from victory, that one can learn from whatever life brings.
I ran for president. At some point I thought this is something that was was within reach, and then it was totally out of reach. So that it happens. You accept it and you go on to other things. You wanted something. If it isn't there, you either fixate on that and go crazy in some sense, or you say, okay, that part of me dies and something else is born. And then a new life starts. And you have many, many lives. It's hard to put a judgment on it. You can be going through something and you might think it's a waste of time or frustrating, and yet later on you can then think about it and you'll learn a great deal. So I find it very hard to make those kind of self-analyses.
It may be hard, but it's very useful, isn't it?
I'm sure it's useful, but you can think about your ideas or your what you're doing. What's the purpose? What am I trying to accomplish? Or what should I do? Or what are my feelings? And sure, I think about that, but I do it in the context of what I'm trying to accomplish. And it's not enough just to have a kind of personal, isolated ego drama. I mean, what
Sure.
is important, I believe, is the common life. But, I don't know if it really matters whether you're eating lunch or giving a speech or listening to people. You can understand things. I mean, God or reality or meaning is accessible to you if you're open to it. Doing the obvious can become quite extraordinary if your mind opens to it. And what makes for an open mind, what makes for awareness, I mean, that's what spiritual teachers have been trying since the beginning of time. How do you wake people up? Most of the time we go through life in a mechanical way. Some people say that we're asleep. Now how do you wake up? How or some people call it illuminated. How do you expand your awareness? I mean, that's the test, or that's the challenge that everybody has.
And that's the key. Of course, you can sanctify the everyday and you can find meaning in every action, however ordinary. But how do you maintain that openness? Because a lot of life tends to close us down.
But that's not just particular to politics.
No.
I'm sure it's true of
absolutely.
anything.
It's true of everybody.
The mechanical, the repetitive, and how in the midst of all that can you step back and see it in a new light. But I find that when I think of what brings illumination or what wakes me up, I mean, it's often the intensity of a particular challenge. I remember when I was studying for the bar exam, just 8 hours of intense concentration, and then when it stops, when the final moment arrives and you walk outside the room and you look out and you hear a bird or you see a tree, you see the sun going down, and it has a luminosity or a brightness, a clarity that you normally don't see, because all your powers have been focused in one thing, and then as you relax and you just let the world come to you, you see it in a certain way that you didn't notice before. So how do you overcome the mechanical nature of what we do most of the time? I just think there's a lot of different paths to awareness or to wisdom or to insight, however you want to call it. I don't know that there's just lots of words to use for that, but I don't think there's any one true path of waking up.
Absolutely not, and that's, I think, what is so exciting about living today rather than a few hundred years earlier, that this is accepted today, that that there are so many paths, that different people are following different paths, and also that it is a whole process, that it's not just a moment of illumination and then suddenly everything is transformed.
And I don't know how you organize that into a political or a common agenda. That is something very personal, and it doesn't quite fit into the ordinary problems of freeways and money supply and interest rates and all the rest of the things that we do in our mundane hours.
No, but it fits into the other category that you've talked about, of raising questions, not in order to provide solutions, not in order to pass a law making prayer at school compulsory. I don't even think that has really anything to do with what we're talking about. But in order to bring certain questions on the public agenda, not the political agenda. I think that they're two separate issues really, but a politician has the ability by raising questions to increase public awareness about them.
To provoke questions, to
Yes,
wake
to
people
raise
up,
questions,
sure. To teach, that's the teaching function of politics.
which is underestimated at the moment.
As our own understanding of nature, of the world around us it develops, then we are going to get a politics and a culture that is more compatible with the world in which we live. And so those themes of protecting the earth, that's a very important theme. 2,000 years ago, people talked about Mother Earth. Today, we don't talk about that. We talk about development, or exploiting resources, or a piece of real estate, or a mineral find of some kind. But there is a larger dimension to the ocean, to the air, to the soils, and all the rest of it. And that natural system is a reality that we are a part of and we're not separated from. And if we can sense that unity, which is a unity of mind and of nature, then we're on our way to breaking down the divisions and the alienation and the insanities that are part of the pollution, the overpopulation, the nuclear arms race, and the tremendous antagonisms that are so rampant in modern society.
When you talked about mind and nature, I thought of Gregory Bateson, who had such a great influence on you. Why do you think he was so influential on your thinking?
He's one person that speaking to was always exciting, because there was something there to be learned, to be discovered. But more to the point, he did have a concept. He had something he was getting at, and that something was that there was a unity in all of life, and that the separation between science and religion was artificial. The separation between the individual and the larger reality of society was overstated and distorted, and the distinction between the human and the rest of nature, that distinction has been confused.
When was the last time you saw him?
I saw him just before he died. He was dying, and I saw him the day before he did die. He was going down very quickly, and he was barely able to talk, and just he started sinking very quickly, and I was with him, and he recognized me, and the last thing he said is he asked a question, his eyes lit up, and he said, "Are there more angels?" And that was the last thing he said before he died. So that was
Did his death affect you very much?
Made me think that it gave me a sense of what it is, and the individual experience of dying. When the time comes that you're alone, and as you begin to fade out, it's a solitary journey, and the importance of trying to understand your connectedness to all of life and to the larger pattern or spirit of things as a way of dealing with this termination of your own life. The excessive emphasis on the individual and the ego and the personality, the career, the reputation, all of that obviously is going to feel very hollow and very thin as you face the hours of your death. And so it seems to me that if you can prepare yourself through your life by a proper understanding of what your relationship is to the rest of the world, to the ultimate nature of things, that dying should be easier. So those are the kind of thoughts that I had as I watched Gregory Bateson die. I thought about how much pain it was, whether he was aware of it, and what it must feel as your world shrivels up or contracts into nothing. It's a hard pill to swallow. So seeing it through someone else is a certain catharsis.
But of course, also you've had 3.5 years in the seminary where you must have thought a lot about it. So it didn't come to you as a surprise.
No, but when when I was in the Sacred Heart Novitiate, we did think about death. That's part of the ascetical life, thinking about not this life but the next life, and so that's something that's always on your mind in the prayers and the religious exercises. But when you're 18 or 19, death is a far more remote kind of thing.
Theoretical, yes.
It's very theoretical and very remote. It just doesn't seem like a realistic.
It's an abstraction. You mean
So
when
when
you're
you see
44, it's more.
It seems a little closer.
It seems closer.
Still rather remote, but a little closer than when you're 18.
But of course, part of the whole Jesuit teaching was the whole idea of living for life and for eternity. So is that something which you've tried to stay connected with?
I've tried to understand that. I certainly trained for that for all the time I was under the instruction of the Jesuits. I would like to see somehow that we could connect this world and the things that are a part of it, and yet see it in this larger flow of history and spirituality, so that we don't downgrade the life that we have, but that we don't get over committed to the illusions that occupy our thinking so much of the time. And as an ideal, that is something that I'm still committed to very much.
So what role do you think political leadership can play in this transitional period?
The scope of leadership certainly can be much wider than we normally think about it, and it's probably something worth worrying about and thinking about today, because leadership is in disarray. There is pessimism, cynicism. Half the people don't vote. People don't take too the language of politics is debased. It doesn't ring with any intensity, with great feeling. It tends to be cant, cliches, and does not stir the soul. So one of the things I've always tried to do is to create some freshness, try to stir things up, and that creates a lot of negative responses too. When I had a prayer breakfast, and I had the Sufi choir, and I had Gregory Bateson give a talk. That upset people, and yet it was a way of presenting the spiritual in a different guise, so as to make people see it more clearly than just having the typical prayer breakfast that normally goes on.
Of course, that's one of the things that we are learning more and more, that nothing is either or. I mean, that idea of the Western mind to have to exclude something in order to accept something else is something which I feel gradually is changing. We're beginning to see that truth is almost always paradoxical.
That's always been perceived by some people, but generally speaking, if you look at the conventional belief systems, at least in the West and where I understand it, the paradox is not viewed with anything but suspicion. People don't like contradiction.
But that's what I'm saying, that I feel it's changing right
the straight
now.
line, this is good and this is bad, this is on the right and that's on the left, and okay, I'm over here and you're over there. People like clear demarcations. And if all of a sudden you say, well, it's partially this way, but in other respects it's this way, and people find that gobbledygook. That's mushy, or it's frustrating. It's threatening and irritating. And the political process strives for consistency, for clarity. And probably what we need to understand and to make this process more real and more effective is to accept contradiction, to accept the notion of change and discontinuity, and yet to do it in a way that is not muddle-headed, but to be clear about it.
And also to accept the notion of changing one's mind. I find one of the most strange and baffling ideas about politicians that they are not allowed to change their minds. I mean, in any other sphere of life, if one did not change one's mind, it would be assumed that they have stopped growing or evolving. But in politics, somehow one is always expected to have to defend the statements that they made 10 or 15 years ago. Is that something that you find difficult?
Yeah, people, it's impossible not to change your mind, because the world's changing. In one sense, you're not even changing your mind many times, but the context changes. And so the appropriate reaction or response is a change. I mean, there's a time when you have to be taxing people. There's a time when you should be cutting taxes. There's a time when you need regulation, and there may be a time when you need to reduce regulation. But when you go from regulating and then to deregulating, that's not a changing of your mind. It's a normal regulation of things, because nature and everything relies on an optimum. Too much of one thing is bad, too little of one thing is bad. And so you always have to be moving within an optimum range. You need a certain amount of taxes. You want not too much, but not too little. And so you have to keep moving. When you're driving a car, you keep shifting. Your hand has to, your arms keep moving to keep the car going straight. When you're paddling a canoe, I once used this metaphor, and people thought this was very cynical and Machiavellian. And I said, obviously you have to paddle on the left and you have to paddle on the right. But that's true. If you stand on a canoe, you have to keep shifting your weight from left to right, or you can't stabilize it and you just fall over into the river. And that's true of everything. But our concepts, generally, that we normally use in politics and normal life, I think for some reason fears that there isn't a shift. And yet there is. There are paradoxes. Ronald Reagan came to town to cut deficits, and yet he increased them more than anyone else. That's paradoxical. And yet if you look into it, there's probably rational reasons for why that happened.
But there are politicians now who are beginning to talk about the need to get away from these distinctions of right and left and liberal and conservative, that the old labels are no longer representing what is happening today.
That's true, and I've certainly talked a lot about that myself, but people want some kind of a label. If you go to a store and you pick up a can that doesn't have a label on it, you're not going to buy it. You're just going to walk right by. So you have to be able to give a guide, a label as to the contents of where you're going, guidepost. And that is the difficulty that we have. And so that's the difficulty that I've had, because I see the need for frugality, but on the other hand, there's the need for growth, for expansion. There's nothing contradictory in that. It just is, there's different orders of being. There's different levels. And understanding that there are many levels in life would make it easier to talk about things, instead of just you're either a spender or you're not a spender, or you're either for the military, you're against the military. You're either left or you're right. California voted for my father. It was conventionally defined as a liberal spender, then voted in Reagan, who was defined as conserving, saving, against all that. And then they elect me, and who knows who they'll elect after me. So all of that, I think, indicates that the people unconsciously know that there has to be a swing, a movement. What they don't seem to like, or it isn't quite as acceptable, that in one person there can be these contradictions or these different poles. And obviously, if it's within the body politic, it's within the individual. And perhaps our political discourse has to mature to accept that.
And when you say that the political discourse has to mature, that's surely one of the functions of political leadership. In the past, you've defined political leadership as persuasive, not just coercive. That, in fact, you said that the most important elements of leadership are not passing laws, but educating and by example, making certain tendencies.
The reason I say that is when a law is ready to be passed, it generally means that is agreed upon. When laws are passed, that means there's a consensus out there that it ought to be the law. So in a paradoxical way, putting laws into place doesn't take very much leadership. All you have to do is just preside over the convergence of forces and desires and constituencies that make that law possible. Just give it a little nudge. But the larger role of leader to define a purpose, to chart a direction, or to have some dream or some vision, that is more difficult. And certainly if I were to look out at the United States and a good part of the world, what is the purpose? Is it, we were talking earlier about, is it just economic? Is it to defend our 1/3 consumption of the natural resources of the world? Is it to is it defensive, or do we have an actual, is there some expanding role that we have for ourselves in bringing freedom to the rest of the world, or whatever? And I tried to define that as saying that we have a twofold role: to protect the ecological integrity of the world so that we can pass on to future generations a world that is livable, and we also have a responsibility to give full vent to the human imagination, the human intelligence, through science, through exploration. But I think it's a ways off yet.
Well, I don't think it's that far off, as you seem to imply. I was fascinated reading Daniel Yankelovich's book, The New Rules, where he has actually done studies with a cross-section of the American public and gives statistics, not just theories, about how, as he puts it, more than 80% of American adults are now involved in some kind of search for self-fulfillment that goes beyond the sort of traditional American dream of consumption and material success.
I think the response to Reagan, to a great extent, was, I think, because he was able to project an optimism, a confidence, a sense of destiny. And even though I disagree with a lot of the elements of what he's trying to say, the spirit of that, in part, is very positive, and that is a speaking to the heart. And I'd like to be able to do that myself. It's not easy. You have to feel it and experience it, and then be able to find the words to communicate it.
It's not easy, but I think it's, in the end, it's the most important thing one can do. I mean, in your position. So, though it's not easy, it's certainly worth striving for it. Because
it's worth striving for, but I'm not sure it's in our individual control. I mean, it's a matter of grace, or of luck, or of destiny, or vocation.
Of ripeness, too.
Of ripeness, however you want to say it.
Yes, I thought earlier when you were talking about how very often in the past, when you held a prayer meeting or when you did things which were unconventional, there was a lot of criticism. Well, there are 2 points that I wanted to make about that. One was that there was a lot of criticism, at the same time there was a lot of excitement about it. There was a lot of response to it, which I don't think you should underestimate. And at the same time, we are at a different age almost. It's quite amazing the change that have happened, even in the last few years, in terms of what people will accept and what will welcome. So that the fact that something was not received in the way that you hoped might be received 5 years ago doesn't mean that times have not changed. I mean, you've always been very interested in the right time to do something, and the ripe time. And in that sense, I think we cannot be bound by the past, but by what worked or did not work in the past, because every moment, every day is fresh, and there are...
Well, and it just, but these moments and what defines them is rather mysterious. And what will work or what will be accepted really does depend on people's ability to hear and the context of where we are in 1982 or 83 or whatever. Are people ready for a transition to a more spiritual age, to an age of greater sharing, of global cooperation, of transcending excessive individual focus? I'm sure we're moving in that direction because all the signs point to it. But when and how, that's the mystery. So all I can do is contribute my part, and it'll then be absorbed by the larger process.
Well, I think what is confusing is that we have so many conflicting signals, because the old is fighting to remain in control, and sometimes it's much more vociferous and easy to hear, and the new is being born, and sometimes it's not so easy to hear. So that's why I think the more in tune one is with oneself and with the larger whole, the more likely one is to sense the right times. I mean, if one goes back to the Declaration of Independence, you talked about the fact that we live in a secular age, but the Declaration of Independence is not a secular document. I mean, it's very connected with the spiritual essence of the country.
Well, the founding of America was a spiritual act.
Yes.
The seal of America talks about a new age, beginning, novus ordo secularum. That's a Latin phrase for saying a new order of the ages. So that people were very conscious in the creation of America that something new on the face of the earth and in human history was occurring. Now, with the passage of time, sometimes we get weary about it. A lot of people get weary about it. But if we can recapture that innovative experimental feeling and the sense that we have a destiny, there is something America has to offer, to contribute. That's a very important insight and sense. And to the extent that we feel it, or someone can communicate it, then we galvanize the society toward the kinds of things we have to do. When people say they want prayer in the public schools, what I believe they're trying to say is there something very deep that we all share, and can we all express it in a common ritual, in a common ceremony? Because without any common ceremonies, we're just isolated, unrelated individuals, which is not a society, which is nothing. And so we're all grasping at the same thing, the recreation of what we remember, or what we think we remember, as a more normal way to live. A mutual, interdependent society where people have a role, they know the role, and it's all in the service of a larger objective. That is what must be found and instilled in the society, and it isn't just mere accumulation of wealth. Certainly poverty is not the answer, and no one wants that. But the obverse of that is also not the answer. Continuous, escalating accumulation. That is not going to work either. So we get down to these patterns or beliefs or purposes, and those are very difficult to deal with in a secular society. That we've swept that away from the agenda, and almost we've left on the table the mundane. And so we have to, can we discover what is common, and can we enrich our lives without the kind of destructiveness that historically has often been associated with those kinds of desires.
And that's why this quest is so much more urgent now, because of the nuclear threat and what that would involve. And so if one wants to start from a specific issue, maybe that would be an issue which is so much in the forefront, and which would begin to create that sense of common humanity that you are talking about, and activate the unity that is the only thing really that in the end would prevent a war like that from happening.
And it's so important that it can elicit a level of responsibility that most things in life don't do. So I see in this effort to freeze nuclear weapons, to remove them from the world, a real opportunity, because it's going to elicit, it's going to challenge people in a way that will bring out a sensibility, a level of virtue that the modern materialistic world has found it difficult to do. And so in that sense, we may be on the verge of one of the most important transitions in all of history, because we've never had the chance to make a decision to preserve, to save, to continue, or just to be destroyed.
And that's where political language and political oratory can become important. I mean, when one reads, say, Churchill's speeches, there was the ability that he had to bring something that was latent in people, their imagination, their creativity, and therefore to make possible the future that he saw. So in the same way today, when there is so much ground for pessimism, you know, on so many fronts, from the economic front to the nuclear front, if political leadership can rise to the occasion and not be afraid, not shy away from using language which maybe has not been heard for many years, and therefore capture people's hearts, because that's really what it comes down to. It's not an abstraction. And then I feel that modern political leaders would not be abdicating from their responsibility. Do you think it's possible to do that?
To speak to the heart?
Yes.
Yes, if one experiences it. If you have to know the language of the heart in order to communicate it. And that's why I think even in the darkest interpretation of the problems we have today also is perhaps the cause of the most optimism. because the starkness, the seriousness, the challenge is going to bring out of each one of us more than we even know we possess.